If you are expecting to launch a podcast and immediately start getting influx of leads and revenue coming in, your expectations are probably misaligned there because it will drive leads for sure, but not necessarily upon first episode.
Why did you decide to start a podcast specifically?
So we started bridging the gap.
Meet Todd Weyandt, Director of Marketing at Applied Software, Graitec Group, host of the award-winning Bridging the Gap podcast. Todd is driving innovation in construction by championing industry-wide conversations and creative problem-solving.
Being attuned to those organic topics, we created ebook around it. When you download it, you submit your email so that it becomes a lead.
Why an ebook? Why not the quiz? Why not the test? Why not an exclusive video series?
Our listeners, they're a bunch of nerds in a great way.
Saying this with lots of love.
Yeah, I do. I love it.
Is it worth pursuing podcast if the objective is lead?
The credibility that you are building in the industry is massive.
People buy from people they like and they trust, not from companies. When a podcast builds that trust, build that authority, this is where the magic happens.
It's important to know your audience and know what's going to resonate with them.
What is still going to be true in 10 years from now that people should focus on when it comes to B2B podcast?
Good question. The first thing that popped into my mind was...
Todd, can you tell me about Bridging the Gap, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for having me on today. And so Bridging the Gap is a podcast centered around really highlighting the innovation that's happening in construction. You know, it's an industry has a bad rap out there. People not inside the industry thinking that it's, you know, there's no technology here. It's maybe backwards, or it's like from the 1950s still, and construction has changed a lot since the 1950s, and there's a whole lot of technology here, there's a whole lot of innovation here, and so we try to kind of debunk that myth and really highlight all the really cool things that are happening here in the industry.
Why is that important?
Yeah, well, there's a huge labor shortage in the construction industry right now, so there's a massive amount of people still that are retiring, and not nearly enough people coming into the industry. And there's a lot of reasons behind that. One is just on the kind of society cultural front of the huge push over the last 30, 40 years to go to college. Nothing wrong with that. I'm got my college degree too. I love college.
Hey.
But it's not for everybody. And so we have to kind of destigmatize going into the construction isn't just like a backup plan. There's a valid, solid career path here in construction. I think we need to highlight that more. So it's super important on getting labor into it. There's a lot of innovators out there that are happening in the space, and they kind of feel like they're alone on an island by themselves, screaming out into the wilderness sometimes, and that's not the case. So like there's this huge kind of army of construction innovators out there, and so we want to lock arms with each other and help encourage and spotlight that.
So why do you think is that? Why do you think there is such a shortage? Is it uniquely about the fact that more and more people are encouraged to go to college, and the construction industry has only jobs without a college degree required to offer, so people don't feel like they would belong? Or is it because the industry is not as sexy as people think it is? Like what's happening?
I think it's a very complex issue that is going on. There's lots of factors that go into it. The college factor for sure is there. The sexy vibe of construction or making construction cool again is another big thing. Like people think that it's, you know, climbing ladders or swinging hammers. And while that's part of it, and there's nothing wrong with that part of it, we have to have that part of it to get the buildings built and get stuff done on the job site. That's not all there is in construction. You know, AI is massively coming into construction right now. Robotics is just freaking cool what is able to come into construction. You know, the like spot dog, there's mind-blowing stuff on a job site, or, you know, you see there's basically like factories that are being built up for offsite construction that you can go out and you can build an entire building in this factory. And then when you get to the job site, you're just assembling it like Legos. I just think that's really cool, and that's really fascinating. It's cool. My boyhood dream of playing with Legos come into real life. And that part of the industry isn't really well known outside of people that are, you know, knee deep in offsite construction. Obviously they know it, but outside of it, that rap doesn't really get there. It doesn't get translated out. Yeah. And that's a whole other issue that I talk a lot about on the podcast is, I'm a marketer at heart. So there's a huge marketing problem in construction, and we're kind of our own worst enemy in this, because one of the best traits of people in construction is the humility. They just want to go to work. They want to do a good job. They want to get the building up. They take pride in building that building. But at the end of the day, they want to go home and go back to their families and, live their life. And so they don't go out and they don't really share what's happening the job site. And if we're not telling the story and we're not going out there and we're not saying, hey, here's what it is about, we're leaving that up to people that don't know the industry to tell that story for us. And that's where you get stuck back in kind of that 1950s construction mindset.
So why did you decide to start a podcast specifically? Was it a podcast to begin with?
We started Bridging the Gap by name probably about like 7-ish years ago.
Okay.
And it was, so I work for a company called Graitec. At the time, it was applied software. We got acquired by Graitec a few years ago, but we're in the construction technology space. And so we wanted to highlight our experts at the company and really talk kind of what are the trends that are happening to our clients and dive into those topics.
Yeah.
And so we launched it as a Facebook Live series, just kind of bringing up like a one question. It was a quick hit, 5, maybe 10 minutes max.
Mm-hmm.
Really rough. Don't go back and watch any of those. They were,
we will have to now.
Not the most polished thing in the world, but it's a funny story on that. So back in those days, could start Facebook Live if you were doing it on your phone. You had to start vertically, and then you could like rotate over into landscape mode. And so it didn't really matter because of the first couple of seconds. Nobody was on the Facebook Live anyway.
Yeah.
So you could like do the slow creep, and it was always just so ridiculous. Every single time I would see the camera just slowly.
I'm picturing you doing this now.
Yeah, just like, this is rough. I knew in the moment, but you did it anyway. So things you do, when you're first starting out.
You have to start, and you start.
Yeah, so we launched that, and that took off. People really were resonating with that, and then in 2019, we were like, all right, we already have the kind of the core tenets of podcasts. We have the name, we have the brand, we have, sizable audience that was paying attention to the Facebook Live. So we're like, why not just kind of flush this out, expand it out, and make this a big thing? I feel like that was kind of like right before the massive wave of everybody had a podcast. So it was still a little bit novel. There was obviously a lot of podcasts at the time, but still more on the novel side. And so we launched it, we flushed it out, and then COVID hit 6 months later, and everybody turned to podcasts, and that was like the main medium. So it was very, luckily well timed into the market and everything. So it was kind of took off from there.
Talking about being perfectly positioned to catch the wave, this is literally it. Like in 2020, it's the year where there has been the highest amount of podcasts created indeed. So a lot of people turn to podcasts to listen to them, but lots of people started them as well. But really the one that survived and performed the most are the ones who were created a bit before, who had already authority that people could turn to. And this is where you were. So why the switch from Facebook Lives to podcasts, right? Why not sticking to Facebook Lives and never going for the podcast specific format?
It's a good question. I'd love to say that there was like a ton of thought behind it, but I think it was like, let's just try the podcast format, see do we have enough content to really do a full show or not. That was a bit of a mystery. We had no idea would anybody really listen to a 30-minute deep dive on a particular kind of innovation trend or business use case for construction or a specific technology piece.
Mm-hmm.
We were like 5-minute bite-sized pieces. We're just going to make it and see what the reaction is. And we really didn't know when we launched who our audience was going to be. We covered the full AEC industry, so architects, engineers, and construction. That's incredibly broad and diverse. And so it was like, are we going to, initially I was thinking that more architects would pay attention and listen. And what we found was that wasn't really the case. It was more on the true construction, the general contractors, the subcontractors. They were the ones that were really tuning in, and they were the ones that were really interested in coming onto the podcast too, to also share about their experience in construction facing and how they overcome that. And so we really leaned into that and kind of took on a life of its own, different than what I thought it would kind of evolve into. But how it evolved was, is massively more than what I could have thought coming into it. So it's really cool to, I think when you are hosting a podcast, you have to come in with game plan, obviously, but then you also have to be very fluid and move with where your audience is going, and pick up on those trends of, oh, my audience is wanting to go over here. Let's lean into that. Let's explore this. And if they, organic conversations start popping up in those episodes, then start moving over there and lean into that. That's what people are kind of resonating with. And so, especially with a podcast that innovation is our theme and our core motto, we have to constantly be evolving and adapting what we're talking about based on what people actually care about and what's innovative now. Because the innovation topic of today is not what we were talking about. Wasn't even on our radar
by nature
even a year ago.
Exactly. This is what innovation means. So
right.
100%. And so I love that you talk about this precisely, Todd, because I just found back the page where there are 4 lives from 4 years ago available there.
Oh no.
Yeah.
I thought we kind of scrubbed a lot of those. Okay.
I'm surprised to only find 4. So I suppose that it was because some of them were deleted because it's not from 7 years ago, but 4 years ago.
Yeah.
Interesting. I won't mention the page, but people wanting to find it will find it. I think I like to keep content from years ago, even if it's cringe and odd, because it's a testament of how far you've gone, right? And it shows that you should get started and that you will get better over time. And it's not about being perfect from the get-go. So, I mean, we are joking about it, but I like it. I like that there are still some live over there. And people turn back to this sometimes, like years after they discover you and they want to see what you started with, and they see the human part of it. And it's like, that's how you create bonding as well. Anyways, that's just me digressing, but I like that this is still available. So, further down the road, Todd, you get awarded the best construction podcast. Can you tell us about this?
Yeah, that was a cool experience. So that was in 2020. There was for years running, there was an award called the Best Construction Podcast. There's not many construction podcasts at the time. There's a ton of construction podcasts now, which is cool to see. I think there was, originally there was maybe 5 or 10 of us that kind of launched. I feel like I was like the second wave. You have the godfather of the construction podcast is the Contact Crew. Yep. Great guys over there. And
Jeff.
Oh, yep. Jeff Sample is now the host over there. So he's been on the show multiple times. I've been over on Contact Crew.
Nice.
Which is, a side note is I think it's a really fun aspect of construction or podcast in general, really, is kind of friendly cooperation between all the podcasts. You would think we would all be competitive and trying to outdo one another. There's not. There isn't so much space in the podcast world that you get to be friends with everybody. So that's not just blowing smoke. That's a genuine fact. It's very cool. But anyway, so the podcast, people could go out and vote, and people voted for us as to win the construction podcast, best construction podcast of 2020. And then I like to joke that the award went away. They didn't do another one. So we're still the reigning champs of that, because it was like a 5-year running award, and then they stopped it once we won it. So I don't know what happened with it, but it stopped in 2020. So we get to claim the reigning title too, which is a cool little feather in the cap. Very unexpected.
I mean, clearly you are doing something right? Because even if there are not many competitors at the time you get the podcast awarded, it's still being recognized as the most useful / most entertaining / most educational podcast, right? Which is super important. I want to double down on something you just mentioned, Todd, which is in the podcast world, everybody's friend. So that sounds a bit like, woo-woo, wishy-washy, but I feel this is true. Why is that, you think, compared to other marketing channels, for instance, you who've been in marketing a lot as well? Like, why does podcasts bring that?
I think it's the nature of listeners will listen to 10 different podcasts of a topic that they're interested in. And so it's not a zero-sum game. Like, just because they're listening to me doesn't mean they're not going to listen to you. They'll listen to both of us, and they'll, even pick and choose what topics are interested. Not every single topic that I do every single week is going to be a cool topic for every single person that ever listens to Bridging the Gap. And obviously we see that in the metrics even of, some episodes for sure get more downloads than others. Fine. That's perfectly normal. And so I think there's also this friendly thing, like we do go on each other's shows to promote even our own show and pull that audience in. And so it's, I think it's something. I don't know if I have a great answer for you on that, but I think it is something really cool in the podcast world, and that we get to, help. A rising tide lifts all boats. Well, we really operate in that mentality for sure.
I love how you position this, Todd, and this makes me think of the all saint father of podcast, Joe Rogan. I don't know if we can call him like this. This is really his philosophy, and I don't know how much of it is borrowed from the podcast world versus how much the podcast world has been shaped by the spirit of Joe Rogan. But he's very much like this in the comedy space and in the podcast space, because after he started, obviously, there are like those gazillion podcasts from comedians, which are all doing great. And Joe Rogan is inviting all those comedians on. He sometimes goes on other people's podcasts, like Fragrant from Andrew Schultz. He invited Chris Williamson multiple times, who is not a comedian, but now he does stand-up as well. And I really feel what you said around everybody's friend in podcasts. That sounds a bit like woo-woo and, like, I don't know, pink world. But it's true. Like, literally, you have this spirit, and that's what I love about podcasting.
Yeah.
So talk to me a little bit about the link between the podcast and the business world, though, because clearly this is also one of the endeavors for Graitec, right? How do you approach this?
Interesting question. For us, we try to make the podcast the kind of the objective third party. So it's for sure linked. In every single episode, we have 30-second ad spot talking about Graitec and what we can do. But I think it's very important that we draw a pretty clear line that the podcast is not just a 30-minute infomercial about the company, that we're really just showing up and we're having those conversations about what our clients are interested in, which then positions us as the thought leaders that we're willing to dive into those topics. We're willing to talk about some of these stuff and not just kind of follow the trend, but we're helping to lead the conversation as well too, and say like, hey, let's focus our time and attention over here. This is a big topic in our industry, and let's kind of guide the narrative over into this topic. And so it's all about a thought leadership play. In my mind, in a B2B podcast, if you are expecting to launch a podcast and immediately start getting, just an influx of leads and revenue coming in, your expectations are probably misaligned there, because you're launching a podcast is a long-term thought leadership PR play. Will drive leads for sure, but not necessarily upon first episode. So just to kind of set expectations there, at least from my perspective.
So is it worth pursuing podcast then? Like, why did you decide to go into this and, not like maybe a more direct response type of acquisition channel? I mean, if we can even consider podcast as an acquisition channel, because as you just mentioned, it's more like of a thought leadership endeavor. But like, is it even worth then if the objective is leads?
Yes, I think it's for sure worth it, 100%. Why I went into it, I don't think I thought it through fully. I'd love to say like it was very well intentioned and like, yes, this was exactly what we were going to do. I don't know if it was. I don't know if anybody can really claim that when they launch a podcast, because you have to kind of morph and flow with your audience. So it takes on a slightly different life of its own once you get going. But going back to is it worth it? I think for sure it's worth it, because the credibility that you are building in the industry is massive. So you're getting that kind of top of mind awareness from a marketing perspective. That's huge and massive, that when somebody is thinking of, for us, innovation and technology in construction, Graitec is going to be top of their mind, because whether they are conscious of it or not, they're listening to the show. We're kind of like seeding that in as we're talking about innovative topics. And that 30-second Graitec ad comes in, or like right at the beginning, it's Bridging the Gap brought to you by a Graitec group. They're seeing that, and they're hearing that Graitec tied with innovation, tied with technology, tied with leading the construction space. So when a need arrives, Graitec is already there in their back of their mind. So that's when they go to the website, and they're much more likely to convert when they're coming in a podcast listener, because they feel like they already have that relationship built up. And while they're not going to be dealing with me on the consulting side, they feel like they have a relationship with Graitec because of the podcast, which is cool.
There is so much to dig a little bit further into. So being top of mind is such an important aspect, like especially in B2B, right? People, I don't know what the exact metric is, but I think you need 7 touch points before somebody considers buying from you. And they won't buy from strangers, especially when we talk B2B, right? Those are usually higher tickets, like much more complex sales cycles. People buy from people. So there is this saying of like, people buy from people they like. I kind of like to tweak this one, which is people buy from people they like and they trust, not from companies. When any channel really allows you to do this, like build that trust, build that authority through, as you just mentioned, thought leadership, whilst staying top of mind, back to the consistency aspect of podcast, this is where the magic happens. It's a much more long-term play, but this is what it can result into. So you have the ad, right, for Graitec. Hey, this is brought to you by Graitec. What's the step that you propose people to take? Like, they're listening to the podcast and then what? They jump straight into a call with your sales team? What happens typically in the funnel?
Yeah, great question. So in that ad, it's very non-threatening. Like, just visit our website,
buy my stuff.
That's right. Then, or you can like subscribe to the newsletter, subscribe, to the podcast and stuff. And then each week when a new episode comes out, we send out email with, here's the link, here's the new episode, here's what it's about, here's kind of my top 3 takeaways. In that email, we have created probably about a half dozen or so different eBooks now over the years. So like, as topics kind of organically pop up, AI being one of the most recent, like how does AI and sustainability pair together in construction? And so that conversation was just organically coming up in the course of every single episode, whether I intentionally steered it there or not, we talked about it. And so it was like, okay, there's something here. And, being attuned to those organic topics, we created ebook around it we have these world-class experts that are coming on, sharing their knowledge. We have a ton of great content here that we can retool, repackage, make it not necessarily bite-sized because it's an ebook, but make it consumable in a different way. And so that's become a big lead gen source that we can go out, kind of repackage these thought leader topics, put our kind of expertise and our spin on it as well too. All right, here's our thoughts on these experts' thoughts around AI and sustainability and kind of our take on it. And you can download it here. And then obviously when you download it, you submit your email. And so that becomes a lead then. So on the Graitec side of things, we're able to see that and go, awesome. These people are highly engaged. They are interested in AI. They're interested in sustainability. So they're more on the leading edge. So we can steer the conversation when our reps are reaching out to them around kind of that consulting package and effort. And we know that they're going to be the innovator. So they're more likely than not to, be highly qualified and ready to take some action there. So I love seeing the ebook leads come in, not just because it is able to tie back to the podcast, but you're able to really gain a ton of insights on who's kind of the movers and shakers in the industry.
So I'm going to pick your brain on this, Todd, because you're director of marketing after all, and I love this topic. So to begin with, why an ebook? Like, why not a quiz? Why not a test? Why not an exclusive video series? Why not insert here whatever lead magnet you've ever heard of? Why ebooks?
I think with the podcast audience, so at least for our listeners, they're very well engaged. They're very informed on the topics. That's why they're listening to a show all about construction tech and innovation for 30 plus minutes every single week. Very complimentary to my audience. They're a bunch of nerds in a great way. And so
saying this with lots of love.
Yeah, I do. I love it. So you need time to kind of unpack. They don't want just the drive-by 5-question quiz. I take those all the time. Maybe that says more about me than, but
there we go.
So I think it's important to know your audience and know what's going to resonate with them. For us, it's important to be able to take the time and really unpack the information there. So if we're taking 10 different episodes that are 30 minutes a piece and trying to boil that down into, one kind of package offering, a quiz doesn't necessarily cut it in the same way that we can take the time on a 20 plus page ebook and unpack that a bit more. So that's how we came about the ebook. Just for our particular audience, we needed to be able to take the time to really flush out conversations a bit more.
I'm going to add, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm going to add a couple of thoughts just that we've seen from various like podcasters and lead magnets as well. 90% of our clients, I'd say, are based on ebooks when it comes to lead magnets. And when it comes to lead gen, especially coming from a podcast audience, right, which is typically going to hit play and then do something else in the meantime, right? So it's not like they are actively watching a YouTube video. Some of them are, and more people consume video podcast. But like, this is quite a passive audience in the first place. The way, and that's completely assumed, like it's not backed by anything, but the least friction you have between your content and the first step of becoming a lead, the better. At least that's what we've seen. And an ebook typically represents that. It's easy in the Western society. Most of the people can read. So it's easy to download, one click of a button and an email address, and boom, they have their ebook. Instant gratification. Versus a quiz where you need to take a few steps, versus like a video series where you have to like watch it now, or as an ebook you can think like, okay, I'm gonna download it, gonna have it in my email box, and then I can read it whenever I want. I think the fact that it's easy as well changes a lot, and the higher the value of the ebook, then the higher the likelihood of people engaging with your nurturing emails and like taking actions afterwards. What are your thoughts on this? What do you think, Todd?
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense as well. Friction is huge. So if I put my marketing hat on, we play a lot with the length of the form as well, and the questions that you're asking on the form.
Interesting.
What's the marketing side? We want all the information. We will want to know every single thing about every single person, every single form. So we play with progressive forms as well too. That if we already have your name and email, we don't need to ask for all that again.
That's good.
Email we do because that's the unique identifier to tie it all back. And so the next time you convert, we can go into what's your company size, and we can keep every time that you're interacting with us, we can ask another question and build out your profile more. We don't need it. The old saying, we don't need to eat the elephant all in one bite. We can eat it in multiple bites. So we take that approach and test out. Different audiences have a higher tolerance of forms in general. Stick to 3, maybe 4 questions and that's it. People are gonna drop off if you ask much more than that in one bite. So we try to take that approach a lot.
Love it. And I guess the number of questions that you can ask also depends on the audience and how much you've nurtured them before and how value there is in your lead magnet. But
sure.
that makes a lot of sense. Cool. I'm gonna throw you a curveball here, Todd.
Bring it.
What happens when you leave Graitec? I have this question because you're not the first guest that I have here that launches a podcast together with a company whilst being in it. And then you become so I think you mentioned it quite well in the sense of like, once people start engaging, they don't engage with Todd because it's not who they're going to have on the phone anyways. They engage with Graitec. Still, I think there is also an aspect of you being the voice of bridging the gap, right? Or one of the voices. So is that something you've planned for? How do you see that? And how does, Graitec interact with this as well?
Yeah, well, first of all, Graitec has been awesome at supporting the podcast. And helping, because for sure there's an aspect of when you are building a podcast in this B2B context that the host of the podcast, that kind of brand takes on a life of its own. So it's kind of, this is a roundabout way to answer your question. Now I will answer it directly in a second here.
No worries.
This kind of strange dichotomy that you have to set up in your mind that for me, I have my director of marketing hat, and one of the products, this sounds really weird to say, but one of the products that I am having to think about the brand and promote is is Todd Weyandt, the podcast host, which is different than like just me.
Interesting.
uh,
I get you.
that sounds really kind of probably egotistical in a way, and it's like this weird mindset shift that you have to do. But anyway,
No, I get you.
So there is this sense that there's that podcast brand a host, and I think that kind of lives on. It's a separate entity outside of Graitec and what Bridging the Gap is. So there's almost like 3 different brands happening at the same time that all converge together in Bridging the Gap. So who knows what the future holds, but I think the podcast host brand, if you will, to keep on this analogy, be spun out wherever and create something new and different potentially. But yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting question. I think it's super fun to do this space. So regardless of what would happen, I love the podcasting medium and would definitely do something. Once you start one podcast, I feel like there's, this for sure, all these ideas for other podcasts, and like, well, how would that work? And like, how could I do this? And like, you keep spinning off all these new ideas and stuff. So I haven't like pulled the trigger on any of those, but I have a ton kind of rattling around, like how would that work bandwidth wise, and kind of thematic, and how would they play together and all this stuff. Anyway, my brain kind of is always going.
So you have not unlimited time and unlimited money, because that's not a realistic scenario. But if you were to have capacity for an additional podcast, because that's literally what we do. We have 2 podcasts ourselves. We don't do more than 2 podcasts because that is already plenty, though we have ideas for more. But what would it be for you? So assume you have capacity for an additional podcast. What do you do? Is it something with Graitec? Is it something individual? Is it in the same industry? Is it something different? With what objective? Like, what would it be?
Yeah, it's funny. I was actually just having this conversation last night with my wife, talking through different ideas. I think what would be, if I'm staying in the business realm, what would be really exciting for me is I can geek out on marketing and branding. That's what I do, as the 9 to 5, so to speak. And so diving into that area of, tackling what's a good campaign, what's a bad campaign, kind of breaking it down. How do you build and scale different departments and have all these different channels and then bring teamwork together. I love the culture aspect of it, and how to create teamwork and an environment where creativity flies. Obviously I'm a marketing person, so I'm very creative, artistic mindset. When you are pulling a group of similar, like-minded, creative, artistic people together, that can be a recipe for utter disaster, or it can be a recipe for just this creative, explosion of brainstorming. And we've been very fortunate I've been at Graitec for 11 years. I've built and scaled the department, and we have created this really tight framework, a team that really thrives together, and we're able to do a lot more than what you would think us individually can accomplish and pull off. And I credit that a lot to the culture and the teamwork, and really bringing people together to trust one another, to let when we are brainstorming, that is a space that there's no bad ideas. Like, throw out anything that pops into your mind, because that triggers another thought somewhere else. So I think having a podcast kind of tackling around that would be super fun and fascinating to me. So I would geek out hard on stuff like that.
I think that wouldn't be a bad podcast. That's double negation. I think that would be a good podcast. That's simple. So there are 2 questions that I ask everybody at the end of the episodes. The first one is, what is still going to be true in 10 years from now that people should focus on when it comes to B2B podcast? What isn't going to change?
So the first thing that popped into my mind was building that trust and that relationship. The host is key and crucial, because, as you already said, people listen to those who they like and who are relatable. So number one advice to people when they come to me and ask, like, all right, I'm starting a new podcast, what should I think about and do? And it's, don't overthink it, and just be yourself, because it will show. I think that was a mistake that I made at the start of when we launched the actual podcast forum. I was in my head probably a bit too much and trying to, be very scripted and, just more tight and not make a mistake. And it was like very quickly I said something like ridiculous or something silly. It was a blooper, and we put it out there to kind of poke fun of like, well, if I'm making fun of it, maybe it doesn't seem so bad, so relatable. That was like one of my number one commented thing. And it was like, okay, I have the freedom and flexibility. My audience won't be like, oh, he's a fraud, because he made a mistake. Human and more relatable, which takes a alerting, at least for, perfectionists like me. Just relax and have fun with it. So once, I think it makes it more relatable. So that's huge. People definitely, they trust podcasts and they feel like it's a friend to talk to as well too. So I know I feel like that on the podcast that I listen to. I'm like, oh yeah, I know them really well. I'm like, I've never met them. Yeah, we are not friends.
Virtually. I love that. I think that's very valuable. 100%. Other question is, if people want to find out more about you or Graitec, where should they go?
Oh, well, they should follow Bridging the Gap. The website is bridgingthegappod.com. Anything on the podcast, go there. You can. I'm very active out on LinkedIn as well too. I think I'm the only Todd Weyandt out on LinkedIn. Weyandt's not a super common last name, so you can find me pretty easy there as well. And then Graitec is graitec.com, and we are a global company. I over here in North America, but Graitec is global, all over Europe and North America. So they can go there, graitec.com, and find out a whole bunch of information on what we do.
We'll put all the links in the description. Todd, thank you so much for coming on Podcast Gurus.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This was so much fun.
It was. Thanks a lot, man.